In the autumn of 1815 in England, polite society made certain predictions with great confidence and very little to back them up. Rain before a garden party, a head cold at Christmas, and the swift departure, before the first proper frost, of any unmarried woman of a certain age brought in to manage the affairs of a household where she was not precisely wanted. Society called women like this spinsters, though polite society preferred confirmed ladies of mature years, which meant the same thing, but took considerably longer to say, allowing everyone time to arrange their expression into something sympathetic before the subject noticed. Miss Patience Endicott was 31 years old, possessed of excellent judgment, a slightly defective sense of when to keep her opinions to herself, and the particular reputation of a woman who said the necessary thing before she had thought of a more diplomatic way to frame it. She had accordingly been recommended to 4 different households in 4 different counties over the past 6 years, and had left all 4 with the accounts in better order than she found them, and at least 2 people per household quietly relieved to see her go. She arrived at Wyndbourne Hall on the 2nd day of October, and society, to the extent that society paid attention to a corner of Berkshire on a Tuesday in autumn, agreed with the comfortable certainty of people who did not live there that she would be gone by winter. This is what happened instead. Windborne Hall had not grieved loudly. It had simply grown quieter, room by room, since the summer of 1813, until it reached the particular stillness of a house that had decided not to expect things of itself any more. Atticus Ashby, 5th Duke of Wyndbourne, had run his estate, sat in Parliament, raised his children, and done everything a duke was required to do with the focused efficiency of a man who had discovered that efficiency left very little room for anything else. Into this quiet, carefully maintained household, Lady Dorothea sent a spinster with steady hands and inconvenient honesty, and waited. Now. Chapter 1. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Toft of 57 years and considerable dignity, showed Patience to her rooms with the expression of a woman who had stopped expecting things to improve and was prepared to be proven right. The rooms were adequate. The fire had been freshly laid and then allowed to burn down to a sullen glow, which told Patience something about the gap between intention and follow-through in this household's daily rhythms. Someone had placed a jug of water on the washstand and left it cold. The curtains were good quality and had not been properly aired in some months, which she could smell. She noted all of this without comment, unpacked her trunk herself, and asked Mrs. Toft what time the household dined. 7, miss, Mrs. Toft said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had answered this question many times and drawn no conclusions from it. Thank you, Patience said. And is His Grace in for dinner? He is, miss, he generally is. Good, Patience said, and meant it, because the sooner she understood what she was working with, the better, and a man at his own dinner table told you more about the state of his household than 6 weeks of asking questions. At dinner, she met the Duke of Wyndbourne. He was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. Lady Dorothea's letter, which had described her son as reserved and very busy and quite recovered from his bereavement, had contained more reassurance than information, which meant none of those 3 things were entirely true, or she would not have felt the need to write them. He was tall, hazel-eyed, with dark hair that had been attended to recently but not especially recently, and he looked at Patience across the dinner table with the expression of a man who had not asked for this arrangement and would like that understood without anyone having to say so directly. Miss Endicott, he said, my mother speaks well of you. She is very kind, Patience said. She is strategic, he corrected mildly. And that was, she thought, the most accurate thing anyone had said about Lady Dorothea in her presence since she had left London. She liked him slightly better for it. She filed this away and said nothing. His daughter Clara, 14, and possessed of the polished silence of a person who had decided that new people were guilty until proven otherwise, sat at the far end of the table and applied herself to her dinner with great concentration and the occasional assessing look at Patience that she did not bother to disguise. His son Oliver was away at Eton and would return at Christmas. Lady Dorothea herself, who had arranged all of this and presumably found it satisfying, talked about the roads and the autumn light over the Berkshire countryside with great animation, and no reference whatsoever to the actual purpose of Patience's presence, which Patience found quietly amusing. The grey cat appeared at 7:10. It walked through the dining room with the unhurried confidence of a creature that had decided the household rules applied to other people, and settled itself beside Patience's chair with the deliberate precision of a cat selecting the most inconvenient possible location. It was large even by cat standards. Substantial was probably the diplomatic word, with cold, appraising yellow eyes and the general air of a senior civil servant reviewing a budget proposal he did not expect to approve. It looked at Patience. Patience looked back. "That animal," Mr. Baxter said from the steward's end of the table, with the precision of a man who had said these 3 words many times and had not yet produced results, "does not belong in the dining room." The cat appeared not to have received this information. "What is its name?" Patience asked. There was a brief pause. Mrs. Toft at the sideboard rearranged a dish. Mr. Baxter considered the question as if it had not, until this moment, occurred to him as relevant. Lady Dorothea said, "I don't believe we've established one, dear." The Duke, without looking up from his wine, said, "We call it the cat." "Ah," Patience said. She looked down at the cat. The cat regarded her with its unreadable yellow assessment. It appeared to find this an adequate response. After dinner, she asked Mrs. Toft to bring her the household accounts. Mrs. Toft brought her the household accounts with the expression of someone delivering evidence at a trial they had been waiting to attend. Patience looked at them for a full 2 minutes without speaking, which took considerable self-discipline, and then said very pleasantly, "And has Mr. Baxter reviewed these recently?" "He has his own books, miss," Mrs. Toft said in the diplomatic neutrality of a woman who had opinions she had learned not to volunteer. The accounts were 2 months behind. Not in the way of incompetence. Mrs. Toft was clearly a competent woman and always had been, but in the way of a household that had lost its governing rhythm. The housekeeper had been doing everything alone without the authority to make certain decisions, and those decisions had quietly accumulated on an invisible shelf, waiting for someone who was allowed to make them. There were small errors throughout, not dishonest errors, but the errors of a person making 1,000 decisions by herself when the work had always been designed for 2 people sharing it. The kind of errors that accumulated the way damp did, invisible until the problem was already considerable. Patience took the accounts to her room, lit the candles properly herself, and worked until midnight. She thought, "This will take until at least February to put right." She thought, "Good." There are in the management of any large household adjustments that are invisible when made correctly, and catastrophic when left undone. The timing of the coal delivery, the linen rotation, which when neglected produced the particular indignity of sheets that had been washed too many times to be described as white with a straight face. The relationship between the cook and the butler and the housekeeper, which when functioning correctly resembled a polite alliance of sovereign nations, and when not functioning correctly resembled something nobody wanted to live inside. Patience began with the coal because it was nearly November, and she had seen the state of the morning room. She did this without announcement, because announcing adjustments invited argument, and argument invited the kind of delay that meant the coal arrived in February, which in Berkshire was already 4 weeks too late. She spoke to Mr. Baxter. Mr. Baxter said the arrangement with the supplier had been satisfactory and had been in place for 11 years. He said this with the particular authority of a man who had been doing something for 11 years and had concluded that duration was itself a form of justification. Patience said she understood, and that she had noticed the arrangement had been satisfactory for 11 years when the late Duchess was managing it, and that it had become somewhat less satisfactory in the past 2 years in ways that showed up in the household books, and asked whether he agreed. She looked at him with the pleasant, steady attention of a woman who could wait as long as necessary. Mr. Baxter agreed. He did this in a tone that reserved the right to disagree later. Patience thanked him and moved on to the linen. She had found in 6 years of managing other people's houses that the most effective way to change something was to change it without appearing to consider it a change, just a small and obvious correction of something that could not reasonably have been left as it was. Mr. Baxter came around to most things this way by March. It was not dishonest, It was simply how things got done. The Duke encountered her in his study on a Thursday morning in November. She was, at the time, sitting at the corner of his desk with the estate ledger open before her, which she had borrowed from Mr. Baxter with his reluctant permission on the grounds that the household accounts referenced figures in the estate records, and she needed them to reconcile a discrepancy from August. She had not thought he would be in at this hour. He had apparently not thought anyone would be at his desk. There was a pause. It had the quality of two people deciding simultaneously what they were going to do about a situation that neither of them had anticipated. "Miss Endicott," he said, "Your Grace." She did not stand, because the ledger was open to a specific page and she would lose her place. "I needed August's figures. I found the discrepancy." "Have you?" "The coal supplier overcharged in August by £4.12. I've written to them. They haven't yet replied, but I expect they will within the week." She paused. "I can be finished here in approximately a quarter of an hour. I need the grain figures as well." He stood in the doorway with an expression that was not quite irritation and not quite something else, something that occupied the ambiguous territory between the two without committing to either. Then he came in, sat in the armchair by the window with his correspondence, and said nothing. Patience reconciled the grain figures. At some point, the cat came in through the door that the Duke had left half open, and settled on the hearthrug with the attitude of someone who had always intended to spend the morning precisely this way. "You needn't stay," Patience said, at 20 minutes past the half hour. She meant the desk. She closed the ledger. "I'm finished." "I'm aware," he said. He was reading a letter and had not looked up. "The coal supplier will repay the £4. She gathered her papers. "If they don't reply by Friday, I'll write again." He looked up then, with the expression she was beginning to learn, the one that meant he was thinking something he had chosen not to say. "You are very thorough," he said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite not one. "I am," she agreed. "It is occasionally inconvenient for people who had been hoping no one would notice the August figures." She tucked the ledger under her arm. "I'll return this to Mr. Baxter." She left. The cat stayed. He sat for a moment in the study with his letter and the cat, and the faint smell of ink that was not his, and thought briefly and carefully that whoever Patience Endicott was, she was not what he had been expecting. He then returned to his letter with the decisive efficiency of a man who preferred not to dwell on things that disrupted his carefully maintained daily order. The cat looked at him with one yellow eye. He poured a fresh cup of tea and said nothing to the cat. The daughter was a problem of a different kind, not a difficult problem exactly. Patience had managed difficult children before, including her brother's youngest, who at 8 had placed a frog in her travelling case with an air of genuine scientific inquiry, and with whom she had been great friends ever since. Clara Ashby was not an 8-year-old with a frog. She was 14, bookish in the particular way that meant she actually read what she had chosen, rather than carrying it for display, and possessed of the careful, defensive self-possession of a girl who had learned that adults would either leave or disappoint her, and had decided to note which one happened without making a fuss about it. She did not speak to Patience. She watched. Patience noticed this, and did not try to accelerate it, which was probably the right instinct, and possibly also laziness dressed as strategy. She let Clara observe from whichever doorway or chair she had chosen that morning, and said nothing about it. In the 3rd week of November, she found Clara in the library with a text on Roman history. The same text, she noticed, open to the same page it had been on for 3 days running, which suggested either extraordinary interest or considerable difficulty. She said nothing. She took a book from the opposite shelf, sat down at the reading table, and read it. After 20 minutes, Clara said, without looking up, "Do you know Latin?" "Enough," Patience said. "Not elegantly." "This passage doesn't make sense." Patience looked at it. The translation was in fact questionable on 2 counts that were not matters of interpretation, but of actual error. She said so precisely. Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who had been told an improbable thing and intended to verify it before accepting it. Patience showed her the Latin, pointed at the verb tense, and offered an alternative reading. Clara wrote a note in the margin with a firm, decisive hand. She did not say thank you, which Patience thought was a reasonable position. It was not a favor, it was simply a correction, and gratitude for corrections muddled the thing. They sat in companionable quiet for another half-hour, until Mrs. Toft appeared at the door to say the fish supplier was here, and did Patience want to speak to him directly? As Patience rose, Clara said to her book, "There's another passage in chapter 4. "I'll be here tomorrow morning," Patience said. She was. Clara was already there when she arrived. The morning Latin sessions became a Thursday and Saturday arrangement, which was not explicitly agreed upon, but simply happened. Clara at the table with her Roman histories and her fierce margin notes, Patience reading opposite or sometimes joining the argument about the translation, occasionally going to fetch a second reference text and coming back to find that Clara had solved the problem herself and was only partly annoyed about it. They did not talk about things outside the books, not at first. Clara was not a person who was easily chatted at, and Patience had the useful quality of not needing to fill silence with sound. But the silence changed gradually. By December, it was the kind of silence that was comfortable rather than defended, and Clara had begun occasionally to say things that were not about Latin, quick observations about the household or the weather, or something she had read the previous evening, and Patience received these the same way she received the Latin corrections, with attention and without making a production of them. The Duke saw them once from the corridor. The winter light came flat and pale through the library windows and lay across the table in long oblique lines. Clara was talking, which was not something she generally did at length around anyone, gesturing at the open book with her pencil, and Patience was listening with the focused, unperforming attention of someone who was actually following the argument rather than waiting to respond to it. She said something. Clara wrote something in the margin. They both leaned over the page at the same angle, studying whatever was there. He stood in the corridor for a moment, then he went to the study. He had correspondence. He had always had correspondence. Society had expected Patience to be gone by December. She was not gone by December. She had by December fixed the coal situation, reconciled 14 months of accounts, reorganized the linen rotation, renegotiated the arrangement with the grain merchant after a frank conversation with Mr. Baxter that had involved a great deal of columns of figures and eventually produced results, and established with Mrs. Toft a working arrangement built on mutual respect, which Mrs. Toft expressed by showing Patience things she had not yet asked about, and Patience expressed by asking Mrs. Toft's opinion before making any decision that touched the kitchen. The household had also, though no one had said this aloud, become warmer. Not only in the coal sense, though also in the coal sense. In the other sense, the one that announced itself only by contrast, by the memory of the months when dinner arrived cold and the fires in the upstairs rooms burned low, and Mrs. Toft had the expression of a woman holding everything in place by will alone. Small repairs had been done rather than deferred. The corridor by the east wing no longer smelled of damp. The morning room was, finally, an adequate temperature for morning. For Christmas, Patience did not attempt grandeur. She attempted familiar. She asked Mrs. Toft what the Ashbys had always done at Christmas, the specific traditions of this household, the foods, the arrangement of the dining room. And she listened carefully, and she wrote things down, and she let Mrs. Toft lead on everything that touched the kitchen. She asked Clara obliquely what had been usual in previous years, and Clara told her in a tone of studied neutrality that communicated more than it concealed. She asked the Duke nothing directly, because she had learned by now that asking Atticus Ashby to recall things he was actively not thinking about produced a particular silence that was not comfortable for either of them, and she would rather know what mattered by observing than by asking. On Christmas morning, the Duke came downstairs at 8:30 to find the entrance hall smelling of pine and nutmeg, and the specific, irreplicable smell of a house where someone had been baking since before dawn. The holly had been arranged along the mantelpiece in the way it always had been, which he had not noticed was missing until he saw it again. The chandelier had been cleaned. He could tell because the morning light through the window came through it properly for the first time since. For the first time he could say with confidence since 1813. He stood in the hall doorway. The grey cat was sitting in the middle of the floor, occupying the centre of the hall with the sovereign confidence of a creature that had been here longer than most of the furnishings and considered this worth acknowledging. It looked at him with its yellow eyes. Clara appeared from the dining room holding a piece of stolen marzipan, saw her father and said, with the perfect dignity of a 14-year-old who had been caught, "Miss Endicott has been in the kitchen since 6 o'clock." "Has she?" said the Duke. "The nutmeg biscuits are very good," Clara said. "Mrs. Toft taught her the recipe, or possibly she taught Mrs. Toft. I wasn't entirely clear on who was teaching whom." He found Patience in the kitchen with flour on her apron and the particular expression of a person who had been moving at speed since before the house was properly awake and had forgotten to look as though this was anything other than normal. She was directing the placement of a very ambitious fruit tart with the focused calm of someone who had already decided how this would go and simply needed the tart to cooperate. She saw him and her expression did something brief, a small recalibration, a shade of uncertainty she covered immediately. "Good morning. I hope this is all right. Mrs. Toft said there were traditions and I—" She paused, looking at the kitchen, at the biscuits cooling on the rack, at the tart. "I may have been somewhat ambitious about the tart." "My wife," he said, and his voice arrived somewhere before he had decided to go there. He stopped. Diana made the nutmeg biscuits. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled once. Outside the high window the December morning was white and still. "Mrs. Toft told me," Patience said very quietly. "I should have asked you first. If it was the wrong decision—" "No," he said. He was looking at the biscuits on the rack, at the particular golden color of them. He had not seen that color in 2 years. "It's right." He was not sure how he knew that. He was fairly certain it was true. The cat had followed him from the hall and was now stationed by the larder door, considering the tart with professional interest and no visible conscience whatsoever. "It will take the tart," Patience said, "if you turn your back." "I know," the Duke said, which meant he had been managing this particular cat for considerably longer than he had acknowledged. The Christmas pudding spoon went missing that afternoon. It was found after some time tucked beneath the kitchen dresser. The cat was sitting beside it, in the posture of a creature making no claims in either direction, and finding the situation philosophically interesting. "It didn't take the pudding," Clara observed, "only the spoon. That seems almost principled." "It's establishing jurisdiction," Patience said, "over the spoon specifically." "Can an animal have jurisdiction over a spoon?" "Apparently." Patience looked at the spoon, "though I'm not certain what it does with the jurisdiction once it has it." Clara laughed. It was a short sound, slightly startled, as though she had not entirely planned to produce it, and it rang off the kitchen walls in the way of something that happened rarely, and for that reason sounded bright. Patience looked sideways at her, with the expression of someone who had heard something worth storing away carefully. That evening after dinner, the Duke sat in his study and looked at the fire for longer than he usually sat anywhere without working. The house made the sounds of a house that had been used today. Clara upstairs, Mrs. Toft in the kitchen, the ordinary creak and settle of a building that had had people moving through it. The smell of nutmeg and pine still reached the study from the hall, fainter now, but there. The specific sound and smell of Wyndbourne Hall when it was properly occupied, which it had not been, he realized, for 2 years. He had spent 2 years avoiding this realization. He had been, he thought, quite successful at it. The accounts had been managed, the estate had functioned. Clara had been fed and educated and clothed, and had grown from 12 to 14 in a house that was correct in every observable way, and had quietly, in some way he had not found language for, been missing something he did not know how to ask for. He did not think about this for long. He was practiced at not thinking about things for long, but he sat until the fire burned low, which was longer than he usually permitted himself. Lord Frederick Fenwick arrived in January on a horse, and under the impression that Miss Endicott would have left by now. He said this, not unkindly, over brandy in the study on the first evening, when Patience had withdrawn with Clara to the drawing-room, and they were alone. "I rather thought," Frederick said in the comfortable tone of a man who had known Atticus since before either of them had opinions worth having, "that the arrangement would be temporary. your mother's scheme, and so on. It has been satisfactory, Atticus said. Has it? The accounts are in order for the first time in some years. The household runs as it should. He looked at his brandy. Clara is reading Livy with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm, which I had not anticipated. Frederick regarded him. Frederick had the irritating quality common to old friends, which was that he had known Atticus long enough to distinguish between what Atticus said and what he meant, and was not always polite enough to pretend the gap was not there. Livy, he said, Miss Endicott has an interest in Roman history. Does she? Frederick settled further into his armchair. And what else does she have an interest in? Frederick, Atticus said with the mild, preemptive warning of a man who did not wish to have this conversation, I'm only asking. You're only asking because you expected her to be gone. I expected her to be gone, Frederick agreed pleasantly. And you've kept her, which is, I think you will agree, interesting. Atticus kept her, he did not say, because the alternative had not occurred to him as a thing he was willing to consider, which was itself an observation he had not fully examined yet, and which he preferred to continue not examining for the time being. She has been useful, he said. Frederick smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been given considerably more information than he asked for, and found it satisfying. Patience met Lord Fenwick at dinner, where she was direct and pleasant and slightly formidable in the particular way she became when she noticed someone measuring her. She noticed it quickly, because she had been measured a great deal over the past 6 years and had developed what she privately thought of as a fine sensitivity to the particular temperature of a room in which someone was deciding whether she was a problem. Lord Fenwick spent most of dinner finding reasons to direct remarks to her end of the table, and was visibly revising his assessment of the situation over the course of the soup and the fish course. He asked her about her family, about her previous positions, about what she thought of Berkshire in winter, and she answered each question pleasantly and precisely and without performing anything, which he clearly found interesting, because he stopped testing her halfway through the main course and simply talked to her, which was considerably more restful. By the pudding he had arrived at some conclusion he found privately amusing, which Patience observed but did not interrogate. After the ladies withdrew, Frederick drank his port and said, "She is quite remarkable." "Yes," Atticus said, in the careful tone of a man agreeing to a statement that contained more than he was prepared to address. "Are you going to do anything about it?" "She is here as companion to my mother," Atticus said. "The arrangement is professional." "Atticus," said Frederick, "your mother left in November." There was a brief pause. "She has been helping Clara with Latin," Atticus said. Frederick finished his port and did not say anything further, which was, under the circumstances, the most generous thing he could have offered. She was ill for 3 days in the second week of February. Not gravely ill. Mrs. Toft said this with the particular firmness of a woman who anticipated the question before it was asked, but feverish and confined to her room with instructions from Patience herself, communicated via a note delivered to Mrs. Toft on the first morning that no one was to make a fuss, and the household was to continue as usual. The household did not continue as usual. It continued in the way of a household that had been running smoothly for 4 months, and had now discovered precisely which thread had been holding the cloth together. Dinner on the first evening was cold in a way it had not been since October. The coal in the morning room ran low before tea, and was not replenished until after supper. 2 footmen had a disagreement about their duties that had apparently been building since November, and had only been managed quietly to this point because Patience had managed it quietly. Mr. Baxter sent 3 questions to Mrs. Toft that Mrs. Toft could not answer, because they were the sort of questions that had been going to Patience since October, not because Mrs. Toft lacked the knowledge, but because Patience had been the one with the authority to make the decision, and the decision could not simply be made by a person who did not have that authority without producing exactly the kind of confusion that resulted in cold dinners and unresolved disputes about duties. She sent the questions to the Duke's secretary. The secretary sent them back with a note indicating they were household rather than estate matters. Nobody knew who that left them for. Clara went upstairs on the second morning. Atticus, walking the upper corridor at 11 o'clock, with a letter he was taking to the post-room himself, because the footman had not appeared at the correct time, and he had decided it was simpler to do it himself. Heard Clara's voice through the closed door of Patience's room. Not the words, only the tone, the quieter, less defended tone that Clara used when she had forgotten to protect herself from anyone. He stopped outside the door for a moment. Then he went on. He sent up a tray. Not through Mrs. Toft. He went to the kitchen himself, which meant Mrs. Toft arranged her expression into studied neutrality rather than the eyebrow she might otherwise have raised, and which had the effect that the tray was sent up with the good soup and the proper tea rather than the under-housemaid's version of both. The kitchen smelled of the soup and the bread Mrs. Toft had baked that morning, and for a moment, standing in the kitchen doorway, Atticus Ashby felt keenly the difference between a house someone had been in and a house that had been running on the memory of someone. He placed the book he had selected from the library on the tray alongside the soup. He had chosen it in approximately 3 minutes, which was longer than he usually spent on books for other people, and which he attributed to the difficulty of choosing correctly under the circumstances, rather than to anything else. He left the tray outside her door. He did not knock. On the morning of the third day, the grey cat was sitting in the corridor outside her room. It looked at him as he passed with the expression of a creature that had been there since the previous evening, and did not consider this information it needed to share. He looked back at it. He went on. By the 4th day she was downstairs, slightly pale and with the particular restrained impatience of a person who was recovered enough to be annoyed about having been ill, and the coal was restored and dinner was hot, and Mr. Baxter's questions had been answered, and the under-housemaid was back on her correct schedule. She thanked Mrs. Toft for managing. She did not mention the tray, but at dinner she looked at him once across the table with her usual directness. It was a brief look, and then she looked away, and he was not entirely certain what it had meant, which was unusual. He had become, without particularly intending to, quite good at reading Patience Endicott's expressions. He thought about this later, and concluded that he needed to write to his man of business about the spring drainage arrangements, which required his immediate attention, and was an excellent reason to stop thinking about the expression. The drainage letter took him considerably less time to write than it should have. In March, a letter arrived from Bath. It was from her cousin, a Mrs. Rowe, who wrote in a characteristically brisk style that she had been unwell since January, that her current companion was leaving in April to be married, and that she had always found Patience the most sensible of the cousins, and would very much appreciate her company if she were free to come. She added as a postscript that Bath in spring was not unpleasant, which was either encouragement or the least convincing endorsement of a location Patience had ever read. She read the letter twice. She set it on the writing table in the library, where she had taken to working in the mornings, beside her cup of tea and the list of things she needed to discuss with Mr. Baxter about the spring grain order. She looked at it for a while with the expression of a person doing arithmetic on something that had more than one answer depending on which values you put in. She was 31 years old. She had always known with a kind of practical clarity that she had inherited from her mother and refined by necessity that a life of useful employment was a more honest thing than a life spent waiting for circumstances to arrange themselves differently. She was good at her work. She had been good at her work at 4 households, and she was good at her work here at Wyndbourne Hall, where the accounts were in order and the coal came on time, and Clara had, just last week, read her a passage from Tacitus and asked what she thought of it, as if her opinion was a thing worth having. She looked at the letter from Bath. Then she took out a sheet of paper and began to draft a reply. She had written perhaps 3 sentences, polite, affirmative, arranging the relevant dates, when she heard steps in the corridor and the Duke came in for a book. He saw her at the table with the letter beside her half-written reply and stopped. "I'm sorry. I'll come back." "No, please." She turned slightly. "I'm only writing to my cousin in Bath." He went to the shelves. He found, or appeared to be finding, a book. He was not, she observed, leaving. "She needs a companion," Patience said, because saying it aloud seemed like it might clarify something, which it did not especially. "Her current companion is leaving in April. I am a reasonable candidate." "You are already a companion," he said to the bookshelf. "For your mother left in November. Patience said, with the deliberate patience she applied to things she had been carrying for some time without saying. The original arrangement was connected to her residence. I had understood it to be. I assumed it would be reconsidered at some point. She paused. Perhaps I assumed incorrectly. He turned from the bookshelf with his book. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the reserved expression, not the not irritated expression, but something adjacent to both, with an edge she could not name. "It was not my understanding," he said. "What was your understanding?" she asked. She said this directly, as she said most things, which was a habit that had cost her several friendships and at least 3 positions she might otherwise have held longer. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not comfortable silence but a man arriving at something he had not prepared to say. "That you were here," he said at last. "That the household required you. That Clara—" He stopped. He looked at his book, then back at her. "Have you written the reply?" "I've begun it." "Don't finish it," he said. "Not yet." Then he left quickly with his book, and the door closed behind him. And Patience sat for a moment with her pen in her hand and the half-written letter in front of her, and the particular feeling of a woman who had just been told something that was not said clearly and was deciding what to do with the shape of it. The cat emerged from beneath the desk. It had been there the entire time, which should not have been physically possible given its dimensions, and which she was learning simply to accept as a feature of this particular cat, and sat beside her chair and looked at where the Duke had been standing. She looked at the cat. The cat looked back with the composure of a creature that had formed a decided opinion and had decided it would share it when the time seemed right and not before. She put the letter in the drawer. She did not finish the reply that day or the next or the one after that. He wrote it on a Tuesday evening in early April at his desk, with the April evening doing something considerable with the last of the light through the study windows and the cat on the hearthrug, and no particular intention of writing a letter at all until he found himself doing it. This was not the plan. The plan had been to have a conversation as rational people had conversations and say the relevant things in the appropriate order. He had attempted this plan 3 times since March and had each time produced results that were entirely different from the conversation he had prepared, including the occasion on which he had told her not to finish the letter from Bath and then left the room with a book like a man who had startled himself. He had spoken to Frederick about it. Frederick had said with the satisfied tone of a man who had been waiting for this, "Write it down, Atticus. You are considerably clearer on paper." This had been said as a joke about his established difficulty with spoken feeling, but it was also not wrong. So he wrote it. He wrote it in the formal style because he did not yet have an informal style with her, and the formal style had the advantage of precision, even when the subject resisted precision. He wrote 3 drafts, each more accurate than the last, which was satisfying in the way that arriving at a correct answer is satisfying, and rather less satisfying in every other way. The 3rd draft said, in part, "I am aware the original arrangement was understood to be connected to my mother's presence, and I am aware I have not addressed this directly, which is an omission I should correct. In plain terms, the household since October has been managed with a competence and warmth that it had not previously had in some years, and this is not solely a question of accounts in order or coal arriving correctly, though I am grateful for both. I have been a widower for 2 years. I have been going through the correct motions of a life for somewhat longer than that. I find when I examine the question honestly that I am not willing to return to the correct motions. I cannot offer a great deal in the way of eloquence, and I am aware this letter is better evidence of the absence of eloquence than of its presence. But I would like, if you are willing, to continue what we have been doing here in a different capacity, permanently. I recognize this is an unusual proposal. I believe you are accustomed to unusual situations and manage them rather well." He had read it back and concluded that it was possibly the most imprecise use of precise language in the history of the English language, which was accurate and which he was willing to defend. At the bottom of the page, in slightly smaller letters, "The cat has been sleeping outside your door since at least February. I mention this as supporting evidence, as it appears to have arrived at a conclusion ahead of both of us." He folded the letter. He sat with it. Outside the window, the April evening had gone very still and golden, the particular light that arrived in early spring, as if it was testing whether the season could hold it, and then stayed anyway. He went to find her. She was in the garden. She was standing near the rose beds along the south wall, the beds that had been Diana's particular care and that had been allowed since 1813 to do whatever roses do when no one was attending to them, which in this case had meant a great deal of vigorous and directionless growing that had served no one's interest except possibly the roses. Over the winter, quietly, Patience had begun to restore them, not in one great effort. He had not seen her do it, but he had seen the evidence. The pruning done a little at a time, the weeds cleared gradually, the beds properly edged. She had not mentioned this to him. She had simply done it, in the same way she did everything, which was without announcement and without waiting to be asked. He had noticed it first in January, a patch of cleared earth along the south wall that had not been cleared in 2 years, and he had stood looking at it for a moment and then gone inside and said nothing, which was how he managed most of the things he found he did not have language for. She was standing among the beds now, in her garden pelisse, her hands in her pockets, looking at the first green canes of the season, with the expression of someone who had just seen something small and good, and was taking a moment with it before going back to work. The April light was warm on the old brick of the south wall. The air smelled of turned earth and the very first green smell of something growing. She heard him on the path and turned. Her expression when she saw him was the open one, the one without preparation, slightly cautious in the way she always was when she did not know what was coming next, which, in his experience, was rarely. He held out the letter. She looked at it. She took it and unfolded it and read it standing there in the April garden, with the late light on her face and the first green of the rose canes at her feet. He waited. His hands were in his pockets. He was aware that this was not how a man in a novel proposed to anyone, and that it was, however, how he was doing it, and that he was not going to get through it any other way. The grey cat was in the garden. It had been there, apparently, for some time. Nobody could ever account for how it got into places. It was sitting beside a rose bush at the edge of the bed, watching them both with the philosophical calm of a creature for whom the answer to this particular question had been clear for several months. When Patience finished reading, she looked up. Her expression was doing several things at once, which he had learned was what happened when she was surprised and moved and trying to decide how much of that to show. Her eyes, in the April light, were the color of the new leaves on the rose canes, the specific moss green he had stopped noticing on some ordinary day in November and had been noticing again, quietly, ever since. "The cat," she said. "Supporting evidence," he said. "I said so." She looked at the cat. The cat looked back with the equanimity of a creature that had nothing left to prove. "The proposal," Patience said, "is somewhat unusual." "Yes. You have described yourself as lacking eloquence, as running a household that was previously in disorder, and as citing the sleeping habits of an unnamed cat as evidence." "The household is now in order," he said. "I credited you with that in the second paragraph." "You did," she allowed, "with some precision." He said nothing. The roses moved slightly in the spring air. Over the garden wall a bird was doing something emphatic with the remainder of the light, as birds in April do. "I don't want to go to Bath," Patience said. She said it clearly, with the directness of someone who had made a decision and saw no reason to delay announcing it. "My cousin is perfectly pleasant. Bath in spring it is a great deal of Bath, and I have had enough of Bath." "Then don't go to Bath," he said. "That is my preference as well." "Your preference," she said with the small restrained version of the smile she sometimes permitted herself, "expressed in a letter. Frederick said I was clearer on paper, and Lord Fenwick assisted with this. He found it satisfying. I imagine he did." She looked down at the letter in her hands. Then she looked up, and the restrained version of the smile gave up and became the full one, which was, he had concluded somewhere in November, a rather exceptional thing to be on the receiving end of. Atticus. It was the first time she had used his name, just that, quietly, in the April garden, as if it had always been hers to say. "Yes," he said, which was not an answer to anything she had said, but was an answer to something, and they both understood what. She was quiet for a moment, a thoughtful pause, not an uncertain one. Then, "I should tell you that I will still occasionally be right about things before I have thought of a diplomatic way to say them. I know," he said. "I am relying on it, and the cat will continue sleeping where it chooses. I have made my peace with this, given that it appears to sleep outside my study as well. I have concluded that it does not indicate exclusivity, but a general policy." The cat stood, stretched with great deliberation, walked between them, and disappeared under the rosebush with the finality of a creature that had said what it came to say and considered the discussion closed. Patience laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, slightly startled, the kind that happened when she was not managing anything. He thought it was probably the best sound in Berkshire, which was the sort of thought that Frederick would find intensely satisfying, and which he was not going to mention to Frederick under any circumstances. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." She held out her hand. "Though I want it recorded that you misspelled competence in the first draft." He stared at her. "You cannot have seen the first draft. I burned it." "I was guessing," she said with perfect composure, "but now I'm certain." He took her hand, because she had offered it, and because it was the most natural thing in the world, and because Wyndbourne Hall in April with the roses beginning, and the light going gold over the garden wall was exactly the place where this should happen, and he had spent 2 years going through the correct motions of a life, and this was the particular moment in which he stopped. The cat reappeared on the top of the garden wall for a moment, sat there surveying them with its yellow eyes, and then dropped down the other side toward the kitchen, toward whatever it intended to do next, which was its own business, and had always been. Stories told with quiet love. Epilogue. On the 3rd of April, Mrs. Rowe in Bath received a letter from her cousin Patience, saying that she was very sorry, but she would not be coming in April after all, and that she hoped the new companion would be everything she required, and that she wished her every happiness and a better spring than the last one. Mrs. Rowe, who was considerably more recovered from her January ailment than her March letter had suggested, she had, it should be said, written it during a particularly dull week, and had allowed the dullness to colour her prose, read this and said to her cat, a tortoise-shell of strong opinions who answered to various names depending on her mood, "Well, about time." At Windbourne Hall, the spring came in properly. The wedding was in June, small by any standard, and smaller than ducal custom required, which was exactly what both of them wanted, and neither of them said aloud, because it did not require saying. Patience wore a dress the deep green of the garden in early morning. Atticus said it was the colour of the rose canes in April, which was not a particularly useful observation, but was what he thought, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she was surprised and glad, and had decided to let it show rather than contain it. Lord Frederick Fenwick gave a toast that was both accurate and indiscreet, and that Atticus has not yet forgiven him for. Clara wrote to her brother Oliver at Eton that Miss Endicott was to become their stepmother, and that Oliver had better come home with an accommodating attitude toward change, because the household was better than it had been, and she was not prepared to have that threatened by anyone, including him. She said this because she was 14, and had been watching the household for 2 years with the precise attention of a person who intended to note everything, and she had observed the difference between a house running and a house alive, and she was, in her own considered judgment, glad. The grey cat was not present at the ceremony. It was, however, sitting at the foot of the stairs when they returned to the house, squarely in the middle of the hallway, on the exact spot it had chosen on the 2nd evening of October as the correct place for surveying the entrance hall, and it watched them come in with the composed expression of a creature that had been managing this household all along and had simply waited for the humans to catch up. Patience stepped around it. It followed her toward the kitchen. Atticus, watching from the doorway, thought, "This is what alive feels like." He did not say this. He was still learning to say things like that, which was, he had been given to understand, acceptable for a beginner. The letter, his letter, the April one, Patience kept folded between August and September in the household accounts ledger. This was where she had found the coal discrepancy, and where the whole thing had, in some sense, begun, and she thought it was a reasonable place to keep something she intended to keep. When he found it there months later, he looked at it for a moment and said, "I did misspell competence in the first draft." "I know," she said. "You guessed." I was very confident in the guess. There was something appropriate about the error. He looked at her. She looked back. The cat jumped onto the desk and sat on the open ledger with the authority of a creature that had jurisdiction over documents in this household and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "Some things," Patience said with the warm, unmanageable smile, "do not change." "No," Atticus agreed with the particular satisfaction of a man who had discovered, rather later than he might have, that he was glad about this. "They don't."
Autumn came on quiet feet through halls that had forgotten light. A woman with no claim to keep, just steady hands and honest sight. She mended what the silence broke, the coal, the linen, every small repair. And in the library's winter smoke, a daughter learned that someone cared. I had been moving through the motions, correct and cold and carefully alone, until her voice beside the roses made this house feel like a home. Stay, don't go to Bath in spring. Stay, let the gray cat keep its watch. I have no eloquence to bring, only this letter and this heart unlocked. When the house remembered how to breathe, when the garden woke beneath her care, I found the life I'd ceased to grieve, and you were standing there. She never asked to be the light, she simply lit the morning fires. She never claimed the right to stay, yet every room grew warmer, higher. I wrote the words I could not say, 3 drafts of trembling, careful truth. The cat had known it all the way, sleeping outside her door since youth of grief. I am a man of ledgers, letters, of parliament and measured days, but love arrived in quiet measures and taught me better ways. Stay, don't go to Bath in spring. Stay, let the gray cat keep its watch. I have no eloquence to bring, only this letter and this heart unlocked. When the house remembered how to breathe, when the garden woke beneath her care, I found the life I'd ceased to grieve, and you were standing there. Atticus. The first time that she spoke my name, April light on new green canes, she laughed, unguarded, warm and free. The best sound in all Berkshire to me. Stay forever, not as guest. Stay as the answer I was slow to see. I offer neither gold nor rest, only a life lived fully, finally. found the love I'd ceased to grieve, and you were standing there. Yes, you were standing there. Some things do not change. The cat still claims the hall, and I still keep your letter between the pages of the fall.